Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Moira O'Brien, and I have the privilege of being the Dean of Science here at the University of Melbourne. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on today. They are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been the custodians of the lands and the waterways of Australia for thousands of years. I acknowledge and respect the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as this country's first scientists, with deep and enduring knowledge of the land and the waters and the skies. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I particularly welcome any First Nations joining us here this evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2023 Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellows Lecture. I would also like to acknowledge some distinguished guests here with us this evening. Senior members of the faculty, the university, alumni, and most importantly, friends. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Alex Filkoff from our School of Agriculture, Food and Ecosystem Sciences, who you will see later as he will be running the question and answer session at the end of the talk, so get your questions ready. And I would also especially like to welcome members of the Grimwade family who are with us tonight. This lecture is being recorded for those who are unable to attend and will be available shortly on the Faculty of Science website, so tell your friends. Before I introduce our esteemed guest speaker, I would like to share some background about this lecture series. This event forms part of the Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellowship Program, which enables overseas scholars of international distinction to make an extended visit to the University of Melbourne and to contribute to the university's academic, intellectual and cultural life. The Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellowship Program was established in 1993 through a recommendation by the Russell and Mab Grimwade Miegunyah Fund Committee, the body responsible for the management of the Russell Grimwade request. We are greatly indebted to that group of people and the Trust. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellow, Professor Albert Simeoni. Professor Simeoni is the Department Head of Fire Protection Engineering at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts in the United States of America. He is an internationally recognised expert in fire and wildland fire science. He has more than 20 years of experience developing experimental, analytical and numerical techniques to better understand fire dynamics and to predict fire and wildland fire behaviour. These techniques are now being explored through collaboration with international research institutions, including ours, and government agencies. Before joining the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, Professor Simeoni held academic leadership positions in fire research in the United Kingdom and France. He has 10 years of experience as a fire consultant in the US and also spent 10 years, very impressively, working as a firefighter in France. He started off as a firefighter and he raised all the way through the ranks and eventually became the head of Chief of Fire Station within his division. So not just theoretical knowledge, this guy's actually been out there on the front line. Tonight, Professor Simeoni will be speaking on the physics of wildfires and how to build resilience in society. In Australia and around the world, bushfires and wildland fires are becoming more common and more destructive. People, property, infrastructure and the environments are all impacted. It is a topic close to any Victorian's heart, indeed any Australian's heart, given our devastating experiences of bushfires in recent years and the impact we've seen fires had on our communities and our habitats. As we look ahead to an even hotter summer this year, this talk is particularly relevant. We are honoured to welcome Professor Simeoni to the University and very much look forward to this evening's lecture. Welcome, Professor Albert Simeoni.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Miegunyah Fund and to the university for the opportunity, for the invitation and the opportunity to present some of my work and my thinking around the problem of resilience in the face of fire. So something that is now an accepted fact in the US is that we have to live with fire. You know, this is a problem that will not go away and that will worsen in the foreseeable future. So in terms of my talk, it's basically, even if there are like several bullet points, in two parts, you know. First, a general presentation of the context, especially in the United States, about especially what is my main area of research and of concern, the wildland-urban interface, looking at how we can build resilience facing these wildfires. And then the second part will be about what we're trying to do in research, and especially centered around the research which is conducted at WPI. So, and then some conclusions. So WPI is in central Massachusetts, and it's the third oldest engineering school in the US. It was funded in 1865, and part of the university, we have the Fire Protection Engineering Department, which is also was funded in 1979 and is also one of the oldest fire protection engineering departments in the world. So getting back to the problem of wildfires and looking at the largest fire losses in the United States. So the most recent statistics we get are from the National Fire Protection Association in the United States. And if we're looking at these different fires, what we see is that a lot of them are actually WUI or wildland fires. So, and you see the amount of the losses, which are basically some of the highest amounts. The only catastrophe which is dwarfing all of the others is 9/11, you know, but beyond that, you have only historic fires which are in the top 10, like the Great Chicago Fire, the Great Baltimore Fire, you know, but in the except for 9/11 in the recent past, it's all about wildland or wildland-urban interface fires. And I'm going to come back to the wildland-urban interface. So some of the worst fires in the US, and I remember looking at these fires, and then we went from a problem that was quite prominent in some states, and especially in California, and these fires happen in California. You can see the western US around here. But there were some staggering facts. First, the amount of the loss, you know, which never before wildfires compared to other natural disasters like floods or hurricanes, but this was a year when it happened. You're looking also at a unusual number of fatalities, you know, and a lot of structures destroyed. And one of the staggering facts is one of those fires called the Tubbs Fire in northern California, in the wine county or wine country of north of San Francisco. One of these fires actually downtown the little town of Santa Rosa burned, and that was a first. You know, this wildland-urban interface is defined as being the area of contact between the built environment and vegetation. I mean, wildlands taken as a very broad definition of anything which has vegetation. And is not ornamental vegetation is growing. It can be agricultural land, it can be forest, it can be grass or shrublands. And so then we realized that the wildland-urban interface was more than an interface. It could go very, very deep inside of the built environment. Another staggering effect is that in the US, contrarily to Australia, especially before the Black Saturday fires, uh, the 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 doctrine is to evacuate everybody. There is no real stay and defend. It's only people who decide to go against the advice and would stay, but they have to fend for themselves, and nothing is actually designed for that. We evacuate people. And again, the Tubbs fire this year happened at night, and people had their no landline anymore, and their mobile phones switched off. And so people just woke up because their houses were burning already. So that was also another staggering fact. And so after those fires in 2017, which lasted from the summer to the winter, the Thomas Fire, for instance, north of Los Angeles, this time burned in December and was actually extinguished in January of 2018. People were like, "That's the worst year ever. It's really an anomaly." Except that the year after, we got even bigger losses. And I'm not talking about the 2021 Dixie Fire, which burned a staggering million acres, but I'm talking about loss of property and loss of lives. And now we doubled the amount of fatalities. We almost doubled the number of structures, and the cost is increasing by 25%. And the surfaces are also increasing by roughly a third. So again, staggering fires. The Camp Fire, if you have heard about it, was a complete tragedy with a lot of loss of lives. It happened in the little town of Paradise, called Paradise because it's a wonderful place over there in the pine forest. It looks beautiful, but it's also very vulnerable. And the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a national lab part of the Department of Commerce in the US, is issuing reports. And in these reports, the next report will come in August, but already in the two first reports, we realized that there were even close calls, and that the fatalities could have been even higher. So that's really what we're facing now. So what was an anomaly becomes an event that is not routine, but that may happen very often. And then the fire season in California was roughly 5 months. Now it's all year round. So that's what we're facing. And if you're looking at the map of the US, and I would take this map, you see that the fires go from west to east and from south to north. We also have, and that's a big concern of mine, a lot of places which were not very used to have a lot of fires, contrarily to California, which is the situation worsening. And they are facing very big fires. And we can think about Tennessee, for instance, and Gatlinburg in 2016, when there were again fatalities, and a small town, a very touristic destination in the Smoky Mountains, which was completely wiped out. So let's come back on the context in general. So there is a large exposure to wildfires nowadays in many places of the world. I mean, I'm not coming here to explain the local context to you. I mean, you know about exposure to wildfires or bushfires. And it has a big impact on lives, health, property, businesses, and economic activity. I mean, it's of course, I'm taking the point of a fire protection engineer, and I'm looking at these aspects. It also has something I'm less familiar with, but has to be taken into account, a large environmental impact. You see ecosystem degradation, and so it can be the southern, western US, like Arizona or New Mexico, where the forest is burning and is not recovering. And so what is growing back is not the forest. Some people used to say, oh, but the carbon impact of wildfires is zero because things are growing back. No. And it's not only in the southern US, it's also in the Far East of Russia, for instance, where the forest is not recovering because you have the impact of those fires, plus global warming, plus in the US, a policy of fire exclusion for almost a century, which allowed the vegetation to grow beyond its natural state, which was at equilibrium with fire. And when you exclude fire, you create more problems. You create maybe less fires, more intense fires in an environment where the vegetation is already under stress because of global warming. The forests are not coming back. And of course, impact on endangered species, impacts on forestry resources, even has an impact on the economy, even in the forest. I mean, timber is a big thing in the US and for even the US Forest Service. And global emissions, because if the forest is not coming back, you have global emissions. The problem we have is that fire is also a useful part of the ecosystem too. In many places, fire is basically necessary for some vegetation. And actually, Dr. Filkoff on campus was telling me about a species, which is the cones are opening after a fire. This is what the sequoias do, and the policy of fire exclusion in the US, we almost made the sequoias disappear because we were not allowing any fires. So now what we have to do in many places, and I will come to that when I'm talking about the research, is there are a lot of places where now having natural and also natural unbalanced fire regimes is not acceptable because it has an impact on people, property, it has an impact on the ecosystem. So we need to emulate that. And so the use of prescribed burns is a very important tool to emulate fire regimes that we excluded and that cannot come back at the same level, but will come back at a much more dramatic level. And so now coming back to the WE fires, and again, Coffee Park in Santa Rosa, that's the Tubbs fires I mentioned before, it burned downtown. And so if we're looking at the Wildland-Urban Interface fires, there are different aspects, you know. There is climate change, but also urban sprawl, you know, and I'm going to mention that again. So with the population growth, we have more exposure, you also have more ignitions, because if you have more people at contact of the forest or even the wildlands, you have more ignitions, forest works, leisure activities, and you name it, like transportation. And one of the other problems we have, especially in the US, I mean, I grew up in France, where the structures are historically stone and then cinder blocks, and they don't burn that easily as they would in they do in the Western US. So in the US, you have also the problem of the vulnerability of structures, communities, infrastructures to wildfires. And that actually compounds to the economic loss. So, but one point I want to make is that because the environment is changing quickly and because of these three factors, again, I mentioned also the management policy of the forest, which would be a fourth bullet point, the environment is changing very quickly. So the value of experience and historical data is decreasing. And I think it's also a very strong incentive for research and for looking at these problems with a new eye, because we're not able to use a lot of the built-up experience and historical data. We can use some, but some will not be useful. So if we look at the wildland fires themselves and the related issues, so some issues linked to the increase of the wildland fire problem are the multiple ignitions. And I'm going to take an example, which is again from the US. In California, at the beginning of the electrification, you had like the dams built in the mountains, and then you had to bring the electricity to the cities. So you have the power lines actually crossing the forest from the mountains to get the power to the cities. And one of the problems in 2017 especially was that there were hundreds of ignitions made by power lines arcing, failing, you name it. So that's an example of multiple ignitions. It's not only the arsonist who is running around and setting a lot of fires, but it's the fact that there are multiple sources due to the anthropization of the land. There are also, with the extreme conditions, there are sources of ignitions which were not common sources before. So there were two very surprising examples that made the news a few years ago. Somebody playing golf and hitting a rock, setting a spark. Somebody doing mountain biking and hitting a rock with his pedal and starting a fire, you know. So that's really the extreme cases. In extreme drought, you can have more ignitions too. And then extreme fire behavior. So that's kind of an umbrella term, you know, but extreme fire behavior is characterized by elevated rate of spreads, higher heat fluxes than the ones that are usually recorded, amber showers, and you see here an experiment that we've done in the field in New Jersey, actually. And you can see how the firebrands can land and ignite plenty of spot fires. And so the shower is a specific definition. It's what's making a very big impact at the Wildland-Urban Interface. It's basically massive and short-range spotting. And then merging fires. So when you have multiple ignitions and you have fires which start to influence each other, it happens. So this is an example in Portugal where you see one fire and another fire, and in the middle there were like 2 kilometers and several villages, and it ended up with 60 people dying on the road. And to explain to you how difficult this problem is that in this case, the first fires, this fire, happened in June, and it was all over the news. There were horror stories like families wiped out on the road. And so there were other fires in October which happened. What did people do? They stayed in their houses. And another 40 people died that time in their houses. So that's a very complex problem, and there is no perfect solution for it. And in Portugal, it's not like the Western US. The structures usually they have Spanish ties, you know, cinder blocks or stones. It's very like where I grew up. So some related issues, I will not touch on all of them, but of course, the safety of the population in the first concern, smoke exposure. So I remember one expert who went to the north of California, and you know the wine country in north of San Francisco is in valleys, and so the smoke stayed there for over a month. And so he went there, worked for 2 weeks over there. When he came back, he had to change all the filters on his car because they were all completely clogged. So now you have people breathing that, you know, and vulnerable populations also. And that's a problem. Talking to some researchers in medicine, they told me that they expect a lot of cancer or the cancer rates to increase in the next 10 to 15 years in the region. And of course, evacuations is a problem. You evacuate, you stay. What are the decisions? It's linked to also human behavior. So now let's come to the fire spread at the Wildland-Urban Interface. So if you're looking at this fire spreading here, you'll see the fire coming and burning the vegetation, and it will spread by convective heat transfer when the hot gases from the flames are touching the structures, radiative transfer, which can spread at a distance, doesn't need any contact, and one of the striking aspects, and of course firebrands, these little particles which will land, and there are several striking aspects, but one is, and we've seen that especially again, coming back to the Tubbs fire, but it happened to a lot of those fires, is that you almost have, you start with a wildfire, then you have a peri-urban fire, then you have a suburban fire. In the case of the Tubbs fire, you had an urban fire, and then it's doing the same the other way, back to the wildfire. So the dynamics of the spread of the fire is very different. And even one aggravating factor in the Tubbs fire is that when the fire is starting to hit the first houses, the houses, when they burn, the construction materials, they do firebrands, which can be bigger, can fly very far, and keep burning. And they landed on more structures, and there was kind of a domino effect, like first firebrands of the first structures ignited by the wildfires, ignited more structure, and then it was like up to the point where a town was wiped out. And so there is also the component of structure to structure, with the three main mechanisms also playing a role. And of course, there is a complex interaction between topography, the wind, the vegetation, and then the structures. So we see things like you see here, the fire did like kind of tongues getting into the community. It's in my native region, so the houses, they didn't burn well. Some burned, but it didn't spread house to house. But you see that your wildfire is breaking down in fingers, and then depending on the vulnerability of your built environment, it can burn more or less structures. And you have these spread corridors. So now getting back to the structures. So I told you about the problem of urban sprawl. So in the 2000 to 2010, and even now, 38% of new home construction in the Western US is in wildland-urban interface areas, is in bushfire-prone areas, if we would say the same here. So even in Southern Europe, to take another example that I studied, this is the Mati fire in 2017. And actually, this is not the same structures as these ones. These ones are lightweight timber construction in the Western US. These ones are more like cinder blocks and concrete constructions. They also burned, and they burn with a different dynamics, but a lot of things which happened in Mati, it was the summer, people had their, tarps or awnings coming down for the summer on the deck of the buildings. They had like the summer furnitures, and the firebrands landing there they started to burn, and then they got into the buildings, and they still had a lot of loss. And actually 100 people died there too. So it's not because we build in cinder blocks that it's not going to burn. So you look at different places, and I didn't want to add Australia because you know this context better than me, but whole areas are wiped out, and we need to get out of that. Building resilience is also making sure that these domino effects, when a fire is entering a community, it's not wiping out everything. In the US, for instance, insurance companies refuse to insure some areas. And even in the case of California, some of the major insurance companies completely left California because of wildfires. So now, if you're losing a community like that and you have 95% of the houses burning, no insurance company will want to insure a community like that. But now, if you're losing only 5% of the houses, maybe the insurance companies will come back. So that's part of building resiliency. And to add up to the fact, the vulnerability in the US, if you're looking at the ornamental vegetation here, it was left almost untouched. So it's really a problem of structure vulnerability. So again, I talked about the domino effect. There is something, this is in the National Fire Protection Association and the Firewise. So they're looking more at now community level things. The first thinking was to protect around the house, and then we realized that that was not enough, and now we're looking at protecting the communities. As a fire protection engineer, I will make a point here, is that a lot of what we're doing with that is based on good sense. on measures which make good sense. You cut the vegetation around your house, it's less likely to burn. But this was a fire-wise community, and it was still wiped out. Fortunately, there were no people there, but the problem is that we need to quantify the exposure to make sure that we're putting in place the good measures to resist to this exposure. And it's not enough to say, let's cut the vegetation. So community design is a very important aspect. And you see that fire spreads in a heterogeneous way. Some structures don't burn, some burn. Some structures don't burn. Even in the US, some structures burn. And the design, we could use that. Why do structures burn? Why do structures don't burn? Of course, part of the resiliency is also to increase the public education, the property maintenance. So that's another example of a fire-wise, proper evacuations. That's a very close call. It was Fort McMurray in Canada. And you see people evacuating. Look at how this guy reacts when it's burning like that. And you'll see that at some point, it just cannot stay there, You see also firebrands starting to ignite shrubs, and the houses are lost just because they have a few shrubs. They didn't ignite from the radiation coming from these trees. They ignited because the ornamental vegetation caught fire, and you see a lot of the firebrands landing here. So here, another example of educating the population is that in the case of the Mati fire in Greece, people got scared, went on the beach, and there was a lot of smoke, so they went in boats, and actually the small boats capsized and 2 people drowned in a wildfire, So of course, educating the population is very important. I also want to caution about the false sense of safety. So for instance, I'm not picking up on any company, even if I'm picking up on them, But for instance, this company is selling, putting 2 sprinklers at the corner of your roof and saying that you're protected. And maybe you are, but I don't know. That's the problem. We need to quantify that. And that's where, as an engineer, I think it's very important. So again, training and education. So we have to train all these people, For instance, that's, again, not picking on people, even if I do, that's actually in Northern California, a building which is sold as being fire resistant. When I see a building like that, on a slope like that, with the grass, and other tall vegetation around, I'm not sure it was quantified properly, So we have to do a lot of public education. And of course, there is the firefighting. And I took this example because that's part of the escalation of means in the US. So here, the National Guard even used drones to help fight a fire. Here it was in Utah in 2019. But of course, we need to help them with the safety of their people, with the evacuations, and also provide to them good decision support systems so that they can make the hard, very fast decisions in the best way. So now I'm going to go to the research, and I have 10 minutes left. But basically in the research, and that's what I propose as some of the important things to do, extreme fire behavior. The new fire regimes that we have to face, I think, are very important. The impact of the fire and quantifying the impact, I talked about that, and that will drive the design solutions. How can you say that you put a fire-resistant material in your building if you don't know what it has to resist to? Then, of course, it has to permeate in the codes and standards. I talked about the decision support systems and the firefighter safety. So this one is just our wind tunnel in our lab where we're doing experiments, of course, with wind, because most of the big fires, they happen with wind. And here it was looking at merging fires and looking at how, compared to a single fire, these are pool fires, it's just an emulation, but a single fire, when you put 2 fires close to each other, when they merge, actually your flames are completely different. And in Portugal, people mention that why did they run, and there were quotes on the road, is because they were seeing flames falling from the sky. because of the incomplete combustion happening in the area of merging and the fact that there were still flammable gases which were reigniting. So what tools are available? Risk indexes. This time I added Australia, right? So because I think also that Australia is a place where some of the early fire and bushfire research was done and has actually developed very good tools which are very, very useful. So we have risk indexes, we have fire spread models, we have fire safety based on empirical knowledge, and I'm sorry if this slide is a bit wordy, you know. Standards and codes, best practice, I mentioned FireWise, but there are plenty of others. The problem, I would say, are many. The risk indexes, the problem is that now we have more extreme events, and we can think about the catastrophic risk which was added to the FFDI in Australia, for instance. And even in the US, we're thinking about adding another catastrophic risk, because now in fire season time, we had a whole map which was all red. How use is that? So we lost resolution because we're shifting our fire regimes. For the fire spread models, for the moment, they are not very good at quantifying. You know, they can give you a quick answer, and usually it's going to give you an idea of the fire spread for the short term. As soon as we are getting into the long term, the models, they diverge with the reality. And again, we have to accept that they may be an order of magnitude wrong. So there is a lot of space for improvement there for empirical or for computational fluid dynamics models. Like I took the example of FDS here, where you see the Wildland-Urban Interface and a fire happening there. And for the fire safety, again, we need to put more scientific basis, because of what I told you before, is that the weight of historical data and experience is decreasing. So we need to get more about the science. So now, getting into the research approach, of course, it's very difficult to experiment, you know. Why? Because when we are going at a very small scale, we have a lot of control, but we are in non-realistic conditions. When we go to the very big scale, we have no control, but we are in realistic conditions, and it's very difficult to instrument. And on top of that, different phenomena happen at different scales. For instance, in the lab, even with my wind tunnel, I will never describe the interaction of the fire and the atmosphere. When we say that the fire is doing its own weather, there is no way I can simulate that in the lab. So the complexity of modeling is linked also to that, you know. Of course, there are plenty of different processes happening, from small-scale combustion to spot fires to the large-scale convection, the turbulence. And so the time scales and the space scales, they span from, I would say, if I really want to get into the details, to the micrometer, to the kilometers, or even hundreds of kilometers for the atmosphere. So what do we do when we're facing that? Unfortunately, we have to span these different scales. And so I'm starting with the field experiments, even if historically, or at least for the recent, like 30 years in terms of the research, that was not what we did first, because it's the most difficult. But I think it's very important. And I would even make a point that for now, and again, I'm talking about the US, if you're looking at every kind of natural disaster, we're measuring them. We're measuring earthquakes, landslides. We're measuring floods, hurricanes. We're not measuring wildfires, and that's a problem. So here we're a step below. We're in New Jersey, but because there is a big national forest. It's around 400,000 hectares. That's a very simple vegetation for me. I'm a mechanical engineer, so for me, like, this stuff is fuel. And so what did we do is that we basically burned plots of land, and here you can see we still had to do some fuel sampling or vegetation sampling, and you see a plane flew, and you see before and after the fire. So this dark area is where the fire burned actually some tree crowns. And we We did also aerial imagery. We had towers, overstory towers, fire behavior packages, and here you see a plot which is around 6.5 hectares with a lot of packages disseminated. And to show a little bit the complexity of this problem, so we went a little bit crazy and we went and we measured, like, I think, close to 100 shrubs with calipers. And we did that before and after the fire, and we measured what disappeared. And that allowed us to realize that not only what the models make as an assumption that everything will be consumed was not consumed. And so for the people familiar with fuels, 1 hour fuels means fuel which is smaller in diameter than 6.35 millimeter. It's just a 1/4 inch. And the other problem that we saw is that actually in some places where the fire was spreading only at the surface, we had not all the thin fuel which was burned. In places where the fire crowned and it was very intense, actually we burn even some thick fuel. So basically your fire is changing by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude when it's moving from a surface fire to a fire which is burning the whole forest. I want to call out also Dr. Filkov because he participated to these experiments. So the fuel consumption is not a set value, but it's a function of the fire dynamics. And let me show you that a little bit. It was an experiment the year after, and you can see a surface fire. You see a few firebrands here. You see a few torching of the trees and some flames which are basically burning essentially the surface fuel. And then you see a crown fire, which is burning the wall layer. And now you see massive spotting ahead of the fire. You see all these little things. And look at this tree. If you look at this tree, with the flames coming close, you see the smoke, auto-ignition of the trunk of the tree. So then we realized, I remember a colleague of mine, we were doing the experiments, and then we at night, we have packed everything up. We're looking at the videos. We see that. First we scream, because for us it was a big win. And then he looks at that and he was like, oh, it's a good place not to be because of the intensity. But if you think about a fire like that, that's what we need to quantify. That's the exposure we need to quantify. Another aspect, I told you, another mechanism of fire spread or ignition are firebrands. And here we collected them. We put a film because we wanted to collect only the hot particles, which were burning through a very thin film, and the cold, already burned vegetation stayed out. We didn't do that the year before, and we had thousands of particles in our pans, and we couldn't discriminate. And here we are looking at a cross view of that with a black panel behind, and we can see something very interesting that was described also with a NIST report on loss. If you're looking at those particles, the fire is coming from this side, but you see a lot of the particles, they come back, There is the recirculation ahead of the fire front. And it was seen in the Bastrop fire in 2016 in Texas that some houses didn't burn from the fire coming because people were very wary of the fire coming this way, but they stuck wood at the back of their house, and this recirculation made firebrands land behind the houses and burn the houses. Again, we need to quantify the impact. Talking about quantification, we measure that. Another call to Dr. Filkov, because he did actually these measurements. And we use the measurements in the field of the size of the particles, and then we put that on structural elements, and we observed when the actual elements were burning. And we saw a mechanism that explained why in the US sometimes the fire is hitting a community, then it's burning a few houses, then nothing, and then a few hours after you see houses starting to burn. And basically the fire never happened on this side of the wedge, which could be like a wedge of a roof. But when, after smoldering for a very long time, the fire went through it, it actually burned. And basically the idea is once the external structure of your house is compromised, then you're losing your structure. So that's again trying to quantify the impact. So now I'm going to go faster. So we can use these field experiments to validate fire spread models. So here you see the experiments and the modeling in light gray. Of course, if we use complex models based on computational fluid dynamics, you also need to get the heat fluxes right. So that's what we ensured here. You see that we're matching the experimental value. If you want to describe firebrands, you need to quantify firebrands. And of course, in the field, you burn one parcel, you take weeks to do that, and you have one set of data. So we're doing more in the lab. We're exposing vegetation to a burner, and then we're tracking the particles and we're measuring them. You see the size of the measurement. And then when you have some quantification that is done, you can start to look at the fire spread at the WUI. And in this case, you remember the spread corridors, right? And so we did that with the fire spread model, and actually it's the heterogeneity of your medium which is creating these fingers. And of course, here we're describing what happened in the field because the houses were non-combustible, or we call empty of fuel parcels, because we're in the south of Europe. But the interesting thing is to think about using that for design. So now you're looking at your community, and you can say, okay, I'm going to make sure that this house never burns. That's almost an impossible feat, you know. You never know. You leave a window open, you know, or a firebrand finds its way under the roof and it's going to burn. But now what you're saying is I can use the heterogeneity of my community with spacing the houses, locating the car parks, you know, putting walls to prevent, you know, one structure to ignite the next one. And then I can break the fire dynamics. And if you ask any firefighter if he prefers to stand in front of this fire or in front of this one, I'm sure you have the answer. So other things we've done, and I'm going to go very quickly here because I'm over time. Of course, a lot of the basic phenomena, we still are not very good at quantifying them. So here, that's examples where we look at the intermittent nature of fire spread and how flames will touch the fuel and ignite it after several ones, something we also observed in the field. We built a wind tunnel in the field to build real vegetation. We're moving it with a crane. And we also observed that the flames are moving forward in an intermittent way. For the heterogeneities, we started to look at how do you need to space your ornamental vegetation to prevent it to burn. Here you see those trees burning and this target tree not burning. In other cases, it's going to burn. So we have thresholds of heat fluxes, and we can use that for design. Another aspect that we've done was to look at how to improve the models. So here it's the drag forces for the vegetation. So basically the friction of the flow inside of the vegetation layer. And it's interesting that in the wildlands, we were able to do a good job for the Wildland-Urban Interface, and instead of considering a homogeneous forest, considering single trees, the model was failing because the trees, they deform with the wind, and then you don't have this averaging aspect. We've done that for doing simulations at the small scale in an equipment we have in our labs to improve the burning of the vegetation. So we were able to represent the mass loss with a different stage of drying, flaming, and smoldering, and then we're able to represent the heat release rate of the vegetation. And now that's just experiments that we are doing now. It's an ongoing grant where we're actually doing pool fires in the forest, and we're looking at the drag through a tree. And this one is coming back to what I was telling you about the smoke, and we're using that to validate models. We're looking at that because when people do prescribed burns, they don't want the smoke to land on a school, on a nursery home, and everything. So we're looking at how the way of burning and the way of igniting the fire will allow the smoke to dissipate more or less, going through a layer. The last point I want to make is that there are a lot of fundamental studies and long-term research that we can do, and believe me, I love that, to do that for years and years. But also as an engineer, we need to deliver. And that's an example that was done in Europe, but that was feedback studies of accidents for firefighters. And even if we haven't completely explained all the phenomena, we already did a booklet to explain to the firefighters, be very careful in this set of conditions. You can have self-accelerating fires and get entrapment and everything. We studied the safety distance for firefighters for fuel breaks. And we're also studying fire investigation because, of course, knowing how the fire started is allowing us to build like data on what are the causes, and then we can deal with these causes. I will just leave you with the conclusions. Basically, it's reiterating everything I've said. It's a very complex problem. We need to quantify so we can design properly, so we can get to an acceptable level of loss. And I will leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Considering increasing population and also changing climate, do you believe our current knowledge and also capabilities are sufficient to effectively, would say, prevent or eliminate housing life loss in the WE areas?
Oh, okay. Thank you for your question. No, I don't think so. And of course, I'm going to advocate for more research funding, That's my knee-jerk reaction. But I think that, again, the problem is how do we reach this level of acceptability for society? What I see happening in the Western US and spreading to other places in the country is not an acceptable level. So we need to find ways to approach this problem, to quantify this problem, to put in place design, codes and standards, so we're going to get below this threshold. And we're not there yet. Another unfortunate aspect that I've seen happening through the news with other natural disasters, like hurricanes, for instance, how many times it took people to realize that maybe in New Jersey you shouldn't build on the beach, because of the hurricanes. It took like decades. And I think we're not there yet with wildfires. We need a very strong sense in society, in the industry, but also with the decision makers that we need really to solve this problem and put the means to solve this problem.
Thank you. Sounds like a very similar problem to Australia. And we have a question over there, please.
Yeah, I had a nice conversation with Albert in the courtyard before, and I said I might ask him a question, and I'm going to ask him a question. Like Albert, I was trained as an engineer, but I didn't stick with it very long, and I became an anthropologist. So I'd like to ask a kind of broader question. I have to confess I have trouble with the word resilience, because how much resilience does the world system have? So it's obvious we're going to have to adapt to a warming world, but it seems to me that the more important issue is mitigation. And that means that we're going to probably have to transition from what we have today, a capitalist world system, and begin to transition to an alternative world system that's based on social justice and parity, deep democracy, environmental sustainability, and hopefully start to move to safe climate. There are a number of terms that are used for this system around the world. Earth democracy. I'm of the school that terms it eco-socialism. So I'm throwing, it's a kind of comment, but it's also asking you as an engineer to grapple perhaps with a larger issue. So give it a go, Albert.
Thank you. So, and we had a nice conversation. I really enjoyed it. I want to say that. Of course, here we're touching on a much larger problem, you know, and I think that unfortunately for our species, we need the drivers for that, you know. Maybe we'll not do all of that willingly, and we're talking, for instance, about the size of the parcels in communities, you know, and so you have competing effects. And what I can say, for what I observed from the fires in Western US, so we built very big houses in tiny plots of lands. I mean, they're slightly bigger than the house. And then for other reasons, we allow no separation between the houses and no protection in between. So we have like some competing things, you know. Maybe we don't need those enormous houses. Maybe we need to make sure that when one burns, it's not burning the next one, because it's not very sustainable. Even if you build a carbon neutral house, if you burn it to the ground, it's not very sustainable, you know. And so getting communities which are, especially in the case of the US, maybe less widespread, so you can bring more utilities to them, you can protect them better, you can get better access, you know, and also thinking about basically what is an acceptable level between our comfort and the losses we are facing, because what you talked in general is just basically the stress factors that will force us to evolve, you know. I think even at a smaller scale in time and space, we're also facing that, and we'll have to make the difficult decisions. But I personally believe that they will be driven by the problem we're facing. We're not going to come up with the decisions or with the solutions before we're facing the problem. I tend to say that, like many other catastrophes, fire is a catastrophe-driven problem, you know. We're not dealing with that until we really have to face it and do something about it.
Probably I'll ask it in continuation of this discussion. Do you think there is a sweet spot between mitigation and resilience somewhere to improve the situation with house loss and life loss?
I think the two are linked, you know. It's just a matter of getting to this threshold when you think things are acceptable, short-term or long-term. But we really, mitigation is one of the other tools. For instance, in the US, in Western US, because of problems, accidents, we completely banned prescribed burns, you know. And unfortunately, when we decided to bring them back, we had the New Mexico fires, was last year. We had the New Mexico fires, which started with the prescribed burn, you know. And so this is part of the mitigation. What is our level of acceptance to say, okay, sometimes we can have a prescribed burn escaping, but in the grand scheme of things, the solution or the tool is helping. That's also another problem, and they go together, I think. Mitigation and resilience are going together.
Thank you. We have another question over there.
I was just curious, you've been talking a lot about an acceptable level of loss, and I was just wondering what you thought that was, and if you have like a quantifiable figure for what an acceptable level of loss would be.
I don't. Honestly, I don't know. I know that what we're facing now is not acceptable. I know that also when we're driving, we know that people die in car crashes and we're still driving, you know. So that's, there must be one. I'm not equipped to define it, but if it's defined, I'm happy to work with that, you know. Everything is part of that, right? Even when we put in place in the US sprinkler systems for building fires, which is also what we study in my department, you know. We know that some people still die, and we could have sprinkler systems and add smoke mitigation systems and add non-flammable things and live naked in grottos, you know. There is an acceptable level somewhere, but I'm not equipped to define it at this stage.
Thank you. And yes, next question.
Okay, so I had a question about, you mentioned codes and standards. I guess one comment I have is in relation to, I guess, building standards. It's very much at the moment on an individual building level, and for a community, that's a planning issue. And at the moment, those two disciplines don't really talk to each other. They both are in parallel universes, because I am working in the building industry, and we don't really talk to the planners. So I was wondering how you see that integration going to happen in the code and standard way, because I don't think planners use that many codes and standards while building professionals do. And how do you kind of integrate that sort of individual building level to a large community level? I don't think that's being done very well at the moment.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think it's a big problem. And I would say in Anglo-Saxon countries, I would say the UK, Australia, you know, the US, there is a very big sense of fire protection, and it's built around the single building like you described. But I would say that it was not always the case, and already in our building protection, we are integrating effects that are at community level, you know. For instance, in the US, when we had the Great Chicago Fire, the Great Baltimore Fire, we were losing whole areas of cities, you know. And we designed our building, and actually there are scientific studies about a fire and flames getting out of a window and how it can ignite the next building, and separation distances and things like that, you know. So now we focus on the single building because we have sort of solved this problem, which we haven't done in wildfires, right? And so we have to change the approach, because now we're in the tunnel of the single building. For instance, I'm part of the NFPA committee on wildland fires, 1140, if you're interested to look at it. And one of the provision was to say that if a building or if a house, even a house was sprinklered, you could decrease the separation distance by 2. Why? Because if a house is sprinkled, it's like likely to burn and then to ignite the next house. But it was not done for wildfires, it was done for building fires. So, and actually we killed that provision recently. But that's an example where even in building fires, we have this thinking, but we kind of forgot about it, you know. So we have to introduce it, and it's very difficult. And very difficult for one extra reason is because of the vegetation. Because the vegetation is allowing things to ignite at a pretty long distance. You know, it's not like a fire starting in your living room and growing and the firefighters are coming. You have a tree burning on your property. It's going to ignite the next house too, you know. And also it's a dynamic fuel. You know, it's growing, it's changing in flammability, depending on the season, depending on its age and everything. So that's, I think, where it's becoming very difficult, but we'll still have to do it. We'll have to do it at some point. We'll have to think about at least, at minimum, the spread from one parcel, I would not even say structure, but one parcel to the other.
Thank you. Yep.
I was impressed with one of the comments you made early, where I'll paraphrase to say, our experience of the past isn't good enough to predict the future in a lot of these circumstances. It seems to me, well, my experience is people have no idea of how bad it can be when they think about it beforehand. Build a house in the forest, yeah, do a bit of work, it'll be nice. but when the event comes, it's far, far worse often than people can ever imagine. How do we get the human element into that to understand that it's not just satisfying what we've done in the past, but moving on and actually looking to the future and going way beyond what people can imagine at the moment? How do we can measure the fire effects, the fire impacts, the fire intensity, but translating that into something that people take as a risk and as a serious consideration when they build their dream home in the bush. How do we move to that scale?
Yeah, thank you for your comment, and I fully agree with your comment. That's where it has to permeate in codes and standards at some point, you know, because it's very difficult to get a sense of that. And in our interesting discussion we mentioned before, we were talking about the fact that also it's very difficult for people to project themselves in the past, you know, and even we think something is hot now, it's not the same definition as hot for our grandparents, for instance. We have a better tolerance to hot nowadays, and until it becomes not survivable anymore, but that's another discussion. So it's very difficult for people to make these quantifications. It's difficult for scientists and researchers to make those quantifications, but we need to make them, and we need to make them not only with the current context, which is already, we know, more severe than before, but also with the people who are telling us what it will be in 15, 20 years, because of course we build a house not for the next 3 years, but for much longer than that. And that's something we'll have to do. And that I don't see much people thinking about doing for the moment, and that's a concern.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and if you have a few questions, we'll have 10 minutes probably after this. You can talk to Albert Simeoni. I would like to thank you, Professor O'Brien, Professor Simeoni. Your insights into WFIS and engineering approach were brilliant. And thank you all for coming, and have a good night. Thank you.